coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
At some point, you have to ask yourself, like, why do the universities deserve, in what sense have they earned the privilege of carrying on in this manner, even setting aside all of the campus craziness and these ridiculous doctrines? Obviously, those are a problem, but the normal that they're trying to get us back to is a normal in which, these over-credentialed, overly intellectualized figures try to remake the regime into a manager's paradise. We already know that doesn't work. It's been failing for at least 25 years, probably longer than that. And it's going to be a hard landing, probably for the universities and maybe for the rest of us as well.
Welcome, everyone, once again to the Roundtable, the editors and publishers podcast for The American Mind. I'm Ryan Williams, the president of the Claremont Institute and publisher of The American Mind and the Claremont Review Books. I'm joined by managing editor Seth Barron, associate editor of the Claremont Review Books and editor-at-large of The American Mind, Spencer Clavin, and last but not least, editor of The American Mind and general man of mystery, Dr. James Pullis. So we thought we'd start today by discussing something that Seth found amusing and wanted to have us cogitate on a bit, and that is Mark Hamill's appearance at the White House. I think, was it last week, Seth? What should we make of this?
Yeah, it was this. No, it was this week.
Yeah. So Luke Skywalker makes a cameo at the White House. It also happens amidst, I saw more than one this week. I think one was from last week and one was this week, of Biden, Ron Burgundy style, reading the parentheticals off his teleprompter. So, I think the one I saw today was, I went to this Catholic school here, and the teacher, or whatever he was saying, I think was named Mary, last name. I think these two things are related, maybe. What do you think, Seth?
Well, I was just kind of fascinated. I guess the first thing that came out was Karine Jean-Pierre was doing a press conference, and she's like, "Oh, and look who's here, Mark Hamill." And he came out, and he was wearing this really terrible outfit, and he had these glasses, had these really dark glasses on. He looked like a blind evangelist, and he started doing something about. He's like, yeah, here I am. He seemed a little drunk, and it wasn't clear what he was doing. And he just started praising the Biden administration for all the great stuff they'd done. Like Karine Jean-Pierre saying, this probably wasn't on your bingo card today, but look who's here, Mark Hamill. And then I guess the next day, they released a video of Biden in the Oval Office. And I guess the whole thing was about this joke, like, may the 4th be with you, like, may the Force be with you, and you do it on May 4th. So Biden's like, may the 4th be with you. And then Mark Hamill pops his head in and is like, always. Now, okay, forget about the fact that, like, Star Wars is, like, totally cringiest. I don't know. I mean, I was never, I guess when I was a kid, I liked it, but I mean, it's just so nerdy and dorky. No offense to anybody, but the idea that what I like about it, this whole situation, is like, well, who is this appealing to? Because Mark Hamill is 72 years old, and he's not a big star. Okay, like if you're a super duper Star Wars fan, like maybe in his 40s or something, you're going to be like, oh yeah, Mark Hamill. It's not like they had Harrison Ford in, who's managed like a whole bunch of franchises and is like a legitimate star. Mark Hamill's just this old man. So here's my point, and it's not that great a point, but I thought it was funny, which is that celebrity is something that the Democrats like own. Like they should be able to get like anybody.
Dua Lipa. Ariana Grande, like
sure.
whoever,
I mean, why
right?
not? But this goes back to like a few weeks ago or a month ago when they had there was a huge fundraiser at Radio City Music Hall, and they were like the three presidents of Biden, Obama, and Clinton all on stage together. And it was like, this raised $25 million and so forth. And like the big, Stephen Colbert, typically was the host. And then the big star was Lizzo. Now, Lizzo's a star, but she's not she's kind of like had some issues politically, with her, I don't know, sexual harassment. And I mean, she's not like Beyonce. So here's my point, which is that I think the internal poll numbers for the Biden campaign must be like extinction level because this is terrible. Like, no, if the best they can do is drag in Mark Hamill to like try to get absorb some of his reflected fame, I mean, that's really bad.
It's so allegorical, isn't it? I mean, I just feel like our society is never going to stop punishing me for moderately enjoying the first Star Wars movie. Like, maybe I'm going to be the only person on this podcast that makes a qualified defense of those first three movies as like, good, interesting, the creative in their own small way. I enjoyed them. I still sort of enjoy them. I recognize that now they have been so desecrated and their corpse has been dragged through so much hideous mud that they have become this kind of emblem of all that is cringe. And it's certainly in that semiotic capacity that they're functioning here. Like, as you say, Seth, Mark Hamill, who was already trotted out for a kind of belly flop cameo in the flagging third trilogy, which was this like weird Disneyfied, ritual sacrifice of all that was Star Wars, when it was like, stop, he's already dead. And then somewhere in the middle of that, they bring Mark Hamill out as like, we thought he was dead, but actually he's living on an island somewhere. And all of us who were just sort of kind of maybe like the first movies were like, who? Oh yeah, like the literal star of, right? So that's what's going on now. That's happening at the level of the presidential press conference. Karine Jean-Pierre says something like, we're very excited to have him here, at which point Hamill gives a laugh, like the kind of bitter, ironic snort that you respond when, when somebody who's cheated on you says, but I love you. Like, that's the laugh that Hamill is like, you're very excited. Since it's so transparently false, even among the audience, who clearly is kind of befuddled by the whole ritual. And yeah, it does feel like they were like, well, the kids aren't going for Biden. And in much the same way as our movie makers and tastemakers continue to pump out like this sort of wheezing dust juice out of dead cow after dead cow. Like, why isn't it working? Like, why aren't you coming to our movies? It's like, yeah, the youth, like, you like there's a scene in Arrested Development where the old out of touch mom gives her kid like $20 and says, here's $20, go see a Star Wars. Like, that's what this feels like.
Well, it's so funny because here's the thing, like, the Republicans have always gotten so much grief, and well-deserved, for like the terrible celebrities that they drag out. Like, Lee Greenwood for the country fans, or Scott Baio, you remember him. And it's always kind of funny, actually, to see who they bring out, because the thing is, that's not like their wheelhouse. So very, very little is expected from the Republicans. But, the Democrats, this is like, they own Hollywood. They're supposed to be able to bring out like anyone. So, somebody was saying this is like, I don't know if anybody in the audience is even going to know who this is, but like, this is like if Karine Jean-Pierre introduced Sean Cassidy and was like, look, guys, Sean Cassidy's here, the heartthrob, whatever. I was just cracking up about it. It's not that big a deal, but it seems so funny. I thought it'd be amusing to address on the podcast.
Yes, I think the rueful laugh was probably as funny as it gets. It's hard for some people nowadays, to understand. But when those first 3 Star Wars films came out, there was a real hunger in the culture for like a new age religion. And those films did so well because of how deeply they connected with that audience, I think. And the legacy of that was, you look at, who's running all the museums in America, like who is like curating vintage furniture and becoming the caretaker of sort of golden age American elevated pop culture. And it's all people on the left. Like it just is. And the dark side of that is that generations of young people on the left, not just celebrities, but on the consuming end, they really look at creativity as this kind of spiritual exercise that can substitute for all the bad old religions that came from all the bad people. And that in this new milieu, you can have like the handicapped superhero and your feelings can be your superpowers. And that's become like an incredibly powerful force. And I do blame, George Lucas for that in part. And it's been just very difficult for people who are not trying to have that kind of new age religious experience to find their place in art in America. It's been tough, and it continues to be a challenge. And some people we know are trying to crack that code, but I think it's going to take something that we haven't quite seen yet. And if Mark Hamill standing up there as this kind of like Madame Tussauds relic isn't an indication of not just the stagnation of the culture, but why it has stagnated in that way, because of the way that it's serving religious purposes for so many people to this very day. If that isn't a sign of kind of where we are and how hard it is to get beyond it, if we just try to slap a right-wing mask or bumper sticker onto a piece of art, then I don't know what is.
I keep thinking of the pawn shop meme. We want a Taylor Swift or a Sydney Sweeney White House appearance. Best I can do is 72-year-old Mark Hamill.
Yeah, we want the kid wants Mark Hamill. The kid wants Star Wars, and mom says we've got Star Wars at home, and it's Mark Hamill at the presser, like wheezing his way to death.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, I hope you're right, Seth, that it means their internal numbers are extinction level, but I don't know, color me skeptical. I heard secondhand about Swalwell, of all people, being at some closed door meeting with executives last week, and they were mostly Democrats, so they were lamenting Biden's headwinds and polling, and Swalwell told them not to worry, everything was under control. So we'll see. I think I heard it was an old podcast, but Larry Arnn talking to Hugh Hewitt on one of the Hillsdale dialogues that Hewitt does every Friday. And Larry put it a good way, which I hadn't heard before, but it makes complete sense and jives with a lot of the themes of this podcast around the way modern government goes. But, post-COVID, we have much more managed elections because of the mail-in balloting, et cetera. And so it just becomes a math and turnout problem. And that's there's one national machine that's much better at managing elections, and that's for now on the side of the Democrats. So we shall see.
I would like to throw in, though. I was at a dinner maybe a month ago, like the New York State Republican banquet, and the new head of the Republican National Committee, like the national one, was there. And I guess he managed the Trump's campaign in North Carolina in 2020, where they did a good job of turning people out. Mm-hmm. And it was clear this is a real numbers guy, and a real nuts and bolts like elections guy. And he was saying, like, he hit all the right notes as far as I'm concerned. Like he said, like, look, we've got to like recognize that there's a new system here. I don't care how people vote. If they vote early, if they vote by mail, if they vote on election, whatever. We've just got to make sure that they do. So he claimed that they were going to like really be pushing a door strategy and, doing everything like to reflect the new reality. So, we can only see, but this is the top guy and they brought him in for this purpose, obviously. So,
yeah,
one hopes.
Yeah, I heard, one of these groups of independent donors gathering together on the right to help improve the country. Rockbridge is what it's called. They've been pushing money into registering fishing and hunting license holders who don't vote. But if you do get them to vote, they vote, 90, 95% Republican, perhaps unsurprisingly. The only dismaying thing I thought about that was, had we only just thought to do that?
Yeah.
And NRA members we've been doing for decades for similar reasons, but you think this is some low-hanging fruit.
They should do gym members next. Every major powerlifting gym.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
These ideas are free, people. Take them, run with them.
Right. Like dollars on the ground. Just pick them up.
Oh, good. I think we've beaten that Star Wars bantha to death. I wanted to talk a little bit about this free speech issue in light of this recent legislation that passed the House with a bunch of Republicans voting for it, which sought to more or less criminalize or categorize as hate speech, I think to be enforced by the Department of Education, among other bodies, but I could be wrong about that. Sort of anti-Israel sentiment. I mean, anti-Semitism, of course, but it seemed to be over-inclusive and people were complaining about it. Now, it will undoubtedly die in the Senate, so it won't be that big a deal, but I just thought it was a particularly silly display of the short-sightedness of Republicans on the speech issue. And it brought to mind this debate that happened at Public Discourse. I don't forget when it was. This a friendly publication, I think was founded by Ryan Anderson, who's an alum of Claremont Institute's Publius Fellowship. Ryan founded it originally. But it was started off with Yoram Hazony with an essay basically saying, rejecting utterly old John Stuart Mill version of speech on campus, that, if you just let everyone speak and you have a marketplace of ideas, the truth will win out. And a lot of it was historical and interesting because Yoram went to Princeton in the 80s and sort of made the interesting point that, look, even back then, Millianism would have been one thing, but it was clear even back then, especially through hiring practices and through the weeding out of any conservative voice on campus and the kind of arrogant disdain that one professor in particular had, where he said, well, of course, the faculty at Princeton and elsewhere is very disproportionately Democratic because, smart people in academia tend to be more sort of perspicacious, and more perspicacious people, of course, are liberals. So, what's the problem? And Yoram's point was just to say, even in the 80s, before the rise of kind of the murderous, quasi-murderous, braying pro-Palestine mob, even back then, the John Stuart Mill neutrality thesis was kind of a joke because it was so one-sided. But at least back then you had civil debate between right and left, and you didn't really see this kind of mob protesting or quote-unquote exercise of speech in the form of shouting people down and encampments and all the rest. And he was directing the piece really at his old teacher, Robbie George, who was a young professor back in the 80s when Yoram was there, because Robbie maintains still that the best option for conservatives is to maintain neutrality and no viewpoint discrimination. And that's really because the alternative is the school deciding what's tolerable speech and intolerable speech. And when the left's in control of the schools, you're not really going to like the result. I thought, the debate was interesting, but in a way, it doesn't really matter. Neither of their positions really matters. I mean, I take more of Yoram's position, which is my alma mater, Hillsdale's position, which is, the purpose of the university is to mold souls and pursue knowledge. And so, no, we're not going to let any old opinion on campus, let alone, encampments as a form of speech. The Babylon Bee had a funny headline that said, Hillsdale College celebrates 180th year in a row without a pro-Palestinian encampment. But this is an academic debate because at all of our Ivy League institutions and our institutions of higher learning, the capture is so utter by the left that I don't even know. I mean, I guess Yoram to prevail and for it to have a good outcome would mean the complete reconquering of all the schools and returning them to some semblance of ideological balance, which is a pipe dream. So I think that the speech debate on campuses anyways is a nice academic enterprise, but I think we're really just left with no alternative but to found new institutions.
Yeah, and if you read this debate as a debate about what principles those new institutions will operate according to so that this doesn't happen to them again, then it's, I think, really interesting. I mean, the bill in the House is just such a classic example of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. I mean, you've got these bloodthirsty kiddie communists, these psychotic children and their abusive professors and TAs running essentially a kind of like mini Kristallnacht in these major universities and associating themselves directly with the Democratic president. Like, this is such a potential black eye for Biden in an election year. There's so much political hay, never mind the legal hay, that you can make out of this. So many different routes you can go, so many different options you could pursue, trying to get some of the federal funding pulled from these ostensibly private universities, like, calling for resignations, all of this stuff that would be like a kind of decent route that pretty much everybody could agree on as a political maneuver. And from the House, we get like, hey, what if we define anti-Semitism as like basically anything that this one organization doesn't like? And somehow they've managed to land on something that basically all the different factions on the right are going to be like, no, like not like that, bro. Like, that's obviously the wrong approach. And so in that respect, like Hazony and George and Arcus are kind of having to me, a more interesting discussion, which is like, okay, but if we can all agree that that's a bad call, and if we can all agree that these universities have gone to pot, like, what is the right approach for a future university? See the point that the Ivy Leagues are dead. Like, now you have this problem which is present, latent in Mill, and even like before that in Milton's Areopagitica, and just everywhere in sort of free speech discourse. There's always been this problem that it takes place within a context of implicit boundaries and barriers. And that's kind of Hazony's point, is less about like what the rules were at Princeton and more about what the functional culture was. That there were these things people would say, well, you would never defend this or that, right? And Mill says, well, you can arrest a guy's freedom if he's going to walk, off a bridge into a river or something. And all of these like just taken for granted like cultural strictures that now don't exist. And it's like, if you have one or two wackos arguing for ideas that are beyond the pale, that's called free speech. If you have a mob of them, that's called a revolution. And it represents not just the glorious flexibility of your system, but a serious effort to dismantle the unspoken rules and regulations of that system, which are largely kind of like Christian and Anglo-European, and like have this whole history that now doesn't obtain. And I feel like that is kind of a more interesting. It gets more to the heart of the problem, which is that, like, as everyone from William F. Buckley to Herbert Marcuse has noted, like, whatever your politics, if you look frankly and honestly at liberal free speech culture, you have to know that there's stuff that is functionally beyond the pale, even if not legally. And like, if the religion and the conviction that keeps those barriers in place is gone, then you do lose the conditions under which you can have open discourse.
Yeah, it's all pretty sloppy, messy. It's going to get messier. You look at these bills, it's just Texas, it's Florida, like Ryan said, probably dead in the state house, in the Senate. But you have to ask, like, why? Why have these things? Why are they even here to talk about? It's a potentially touchy subject. There are those who would insist that some sort of behind the scenes influence operation is being wielded effectively on Republican office holders. But I think it's a little more to the point to observe that this kind of cold Jewish war, civil war that's been playing out for a while is continuing to heat up. It's the first time in a long time that Jewish Americans are as much quote unquote in play, as they say, for the presidential election season. I'm sure these two things are interrelated in some way. And there is, there are incentives to try to swing this particular group toward not just Trump, but toward the GOP in general, especially among people who are still sort of hoping or planning for the Trump episode of American politics to fade away, and for those people themselves to rise to some leadership position. So there's all this jockeying going on, and the temptation is just very strong to say to any identity group, like, we will make you the most protected of the protected classes, even if they don't really mean it, even if it's not going to happen in real life. Simply, doing that virtue signaling bit of quote unquote standing with whoever it is who you want to support you. It's just a very powerful temptation. And seeing it play out at this level and wondering at what next and higher level it's going to play out at, I think, that would give anyone pause who is more interested in the nuts and bolts of maintaining a constitutional republic.
Yeah, I mean, as far as like what's happening on campus and free speech and all of that, I mean, I sort of haven't really been able to understand why everyone is so worked up about what's happening on a bunch of elite campuses or not so elite campuses, like, CCNY. I mean, to my mind, maybe I said this before, but like campuses only serve to do stuff for the students. So if the students want to shut it down, okay. I mean, it's not going to affect anybody else. I mean, I'm not saying that we should let them do it, but I don't see any reason to like get particularly upset if a bunch of whiny students and like their annoying professors, want to camp out. I mean, just let them do it. But as far as what James was saying, I think is more to the point. Like I saw like John Lovitz, the comedian, like he's an old time liberal. And he's saying, he's a Democrat. He's like, what's going on here? I don't get it. Like 70 Democrats voted against this anti-Semitism bill. So, he's not really up on all of the ins and outs of the legislative process or of like, the philosophy behind Areopagitica and all of that. But like if the Republicans can sow enough doubt in kind of just mainstream Jewish Democrats, like liberals, get them to think twice about donations or just like voting, even if they don't vote R, just to like stay home. Like, well, I'm not voting for the Dems this time until they figure this out. I mean, Trump only has to flip Pennsylvania and Georgia. So if you get enough Jews in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh to be like, I'm sitting this one out, that can be like huge. So, I mean, look, is the bill idiotic? Yeah, it seems that way. But like you said, it's not going to pass. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's a good chance it was just performative in the House to a certain extent. And the calculation by many members was just, well, yeah, the Senate, it'll die in the Senate, so we can make a symbolic vote. And it's like, why should I put myself on the record as being against anti-Semitism? I'll just vote for it. I'm sure there was a lot of that too.
I mean, that is something that Democrats do all the time, right?
Yeah.
They put up some bill that they get to call like the Pro Fluffy Children and Bunnies Act, and then it's about chemical castrations for 12-year-olds. And if you don't vote for it, you look like you're anti-children and bunnies or something. And like, so that's, that would be a smart tactic. I maintain that there would have been like much more sophisticated ways to do it than this. And my reason for saying that is just because you don't want to end up in a situation where in the process of picking off a few admittedly very important like Jewish voters, you end up alienating your base or your like major supporters. And this may be a place where I'm too Twitter brained to really be seeing what's going on in real life. But I did see a lot of people not only freaking out about this as a sort of betrayal or a failure, but freaking out about a bill that wasn't the bill they actually passed, like thinking that this applied to more than colleges, that this was going to be about the country's speech laws in general, but then also using it as fodder for some of the other stuff that James was talking about, which is kind of ascendant on the right, like, the Jewish lobbies paying these guys off or whatever. So it felt counterproductive in that way too, and just kind of like ham-fisted. But I take the point that, if you do want to use this moment to make the valid and true argument that the Democrat Party, and especially its more radical members, are like not friends to the Jewish people who mostly support them and fund them and all of this stuff. But you don't want, as I think James was sort of alluding to do it by saying, we'll basically make you the new blacks. Like we'll put you in a position where you're so untouchable that none of the normal rules apply to you. And there's already, I think, like a realization going on that offer was made in some ways, not just by Democrats, but by like kind of civilized life after the Holocaust. It was like, well, and Yoram, I think, gives this example in his piece, like after the Holocaust, it was just sort of understood that decent people don't call for the extermination of Jews, don't indulge in anti-Jewish stereotypes. And so like, you kind of do, you wish you could just write into law that we would all kind of agree not to do that anymore, but you can't write that into law. And like making that your position or your sell to disaffected Jewish voters is like kind of disaffecting a whole bunch of other people in the process that you also need to win. And also it's also the wrong thing to say, right? Like you want to make a different pitch.
It brings to mind this anecdote I think I've shared on here before. It was in the context of, back when the Westboro Baptist Church was standing outside military funerals with signs that said God hates and a based boomer who works at an institution we all know and love, not the Claremont Institute, a different one. He said, this just wouldn't have been a problem. I mean, there was the court case about it, and Alito was one of the more sensible ones on it. But the case basically took the side of, million maximalism on speech. And Alito's position was that there's certain kinds of speech that amount to the equivalent of an assault. Anyway, that was the whole context of the following comment, which I really liked. It's like, in 1950s, 60s, even 60s America, maybe early 60s, mid-century America, this wouldn't have been a problem because the first time those guys did that at a funeral, they would all gotten beaten up by the local community, and they wouldn't do it anymore. But so I think it's also the state of the campus today, which Yoram was, it was implicit in Yoram's argument is a part of a larger phenomenon, which is troubling, which is the kind of breaking apart at the seams of civic community in America and the collapse of a kind of a widely held moral sense of moral decency.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing about what Spencer was saying, and I totally agree. Like, I don't think that it behooves the Republicans to, sanctify Jews and to say that like any criticism of Israel is necessarily and all of this kind of stuff. I think it's idiotic. And right, you don't want to be put in the position of making it seem like, oh, the Republicans are just beholden to Big Jew. The problem is that the anti-Semites think that anyway. Like they don't care. Like they're completely like I saw on Twitter whatever. Like my feed now is just like filled with like stuff about Jews this, Jews that. Like somebody has this book about how the early Puritans were interested in Kabbalah, like Jewish mysticism, and everybody knows that the Puritans were very into the Hebrew Bible and fashioning this new nation. They saw themselves as some new figure of Israel and all of that. I mean, this is not news. But somebody's saying wow, Protestant America has always been a Jewish project.
Why did nobody teach me this in school, right? I never learned this in
exactly.
school.
So I was like, hey, guess what? Christianity was a Jewish project. I mean, and somebody else was saying oh, look, here's some guy who's saying that the Dutch naval empire of the 16th century was an early example of global Jewish finance. So it's there is this idiotic point of view where everything is Jewish except for the Jews who are not the real Jews.
Yeah, they somehow lost the covenant at some point.
So it's all just I mean, I guess you don't want to be put in a position of making it look like, oh, the Jews are pulling the strings, but anti-Semites think that they always think that. You can't get around that.
This is so important, Seth, and kind of I find it kind of complicated because my feed too is now graced regularly with you Jewish or whatever thing, and you're absolutely right. The part of the dynamic is that accusation invites the temptation that if you can prove some part of this false, if they say something about you that's not true, the temptation is to correct this, because then you think you're in a conversation with a rational individual that's going to be like, oh, I was facially wrong about a major fact. Perhaps I should reconsider. But that is absolutely not what's at issue here or how this is operating. And so there does then emerge this problem where you have to think about how to relate to this contingent of, I don't know, maybe a lot of bots, but also a lot of people. And for me, at least in a individual level, and this does have an application, I promise, to Congress and all that, but I have this personal policy where I try really hard never not to say or tweet anything because I'm worried about what they're going to think or say, but also never to say or tweet anything to spite them. As hard as I can, I try to think what would I say if this weren't a factor in life? Because as you say, nothing you say will affect them, and nothing they say has any merit. And so then you have, but that is psychologically very difficult. And I guess this bill strikes me as an example of that dynamic writ large, right? You don't want to be curtailing what you do and say just to cater to the worst element in human life, left or right. But you also, don't want to be just kind of going full max in the opposite direction just to spite them. We'll show those anti-Semites. We will turn Jewish people into a protected class to end all protected classes, right? And that is kind of it strikes me as a danger here.
Yeah, I was going to make a joke about, and this is not because he's Jewish, but just because of his inner psychology of you never go full John Podhoretz on Twitter. It's always a bad idea. His only mode is splenetic venting on X, it seems like. I wanted to bring up this interesting, this won't be news to any of our listeners, or they've probably seen the topic discussed before, but this replicability crisis. Jonathan Haidt and others have written about it, especially in the social sciences, but everyone's favorite social statistician Anon on Twitter, Cremu, had this little three post thread. I just want to read it because it's real short. Some economists tried to reproduce the results of 67 economics papers, and they pretty much couldn't do it. Even with the help from authors, only half of papers ended up being reproducible, and this was still a problem at journals with required reporting of code and data. An earlier paper looked at the evidence for reproducibility in international development impact evaluations, another econ topic of sorts. Similar story there. Too much data was simply unavailable. Some was discrepant. Another publication looked at 67 journals and recorded across economics, political science, sociology, psychology, and general science journals' code and data requirements are rare, and checking results was only a common occurrence in political science. In short, it's hard to tell what scientific work is legit because so little of it includes the code and data required to figure that out. It's just, I had a post about it because this is a sort of a running theme of mine and many others, which is we have this annoying development in modern politics where really the only valid source of authority in our modern bureaucratized and scientific bureaucratized world, the only valid source of right, you might even say natural right, of a certain perverted kind is the hard sciences and the extent to which the softer sciences mimic the hard sciences. So you inevitably hear, well, studies show, and then some politician makes an argument for their favorite policy position. And I just want to remind everyone, and the audience probably knows this well, that it looks like from the state of modern social science, most of it's never cited. And so it's just howling into a whirlwind of unread, published stuff. And to the extent that a lot of it's cited, it's pretty hard to tell if any of the stuff cited is actual science. And I guess this gets back to the older problem. This is like, not to go all Austrian economist on this, but this has been the critique of using economics as if it were physics to manipulate the world of social science. That is to say, manipulate a populace and its outcomes and all the rest. So we're just still stuck, and we've been stuck in this loop for about 100 years. And I guess we can really judge this tree by the fruit that it bears, and it hasn't really been that good across the Anglosphere for the last century.
This reminds me of a funny video I saw last week where Jared Bernstein, who's the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, he's being interviewed, I think, by one of those like modern monetary theorist people, like the ones who say that there's no such thing as debt in a command economy such as ours, where we can just print money. But she's asking, and I don't really agree with that stuff. I don't think it makes very much sense. But she's asking him, okay, we have an economy that prints money, so why do we also have to borrow money? And it's so worth checking out. It's amazing. Wow. He just gets completely flustered. He's like, hold on a second. You're saying yes, we do print money and we issue debt. So is that that's borrowing money. He's like, we definitely do those things. But I get very confused. I don't know. Okay, now maybe Jared Bernstein is actually a musician, and then he has like a social work degree. So I don't know why he's like considered like a hero of the progressive left. So, but he is like considered like an economist, even though he doesn't have a degree in economics. I don't know if that matters actually. But it is kind of a good question. Like, we're all sort of like, on the conservative side. I'm not exactly sure why a country that can print money also has to borrow money. I'm not an economist, so I can't answer it. But it's a very funny, it sort of makes you wonder, well, what exactly is it that economists do?
Well, I'm not a biologist. I'm not a lawyer. You know what this kind of reminds me of, to speak in an area where I do have some knowledge, is bodybuilding and nutrition. There actually are some domains in that field. Like if you want to get super jacked and healthy or whatever, your biology overlaps with chemistry and all sorts of kind of knowable scientific realities. And it is possible to get sort of information that you wouldn't otherwise have from scientific studies that can be then directly useful. And you can go like do a rep slightly differently because of what some study says or whatever. And if you find sources you trust, by the way, one of our writers, Raw Egg Nationalists, really good on this stuff. If you find sources you trust, you can actually get stuff that is true that you wouldn't have known otherwise out of the scientific process. Hey, cool. Like, look, it works, mom. But then you find these people who will be saying things like, well, it's nice for you that you like lost 10 pounds through dieting and regular exercise. But this study shows that some people, of whom I count myself one, like just genetically don't lose weight no matter how few calories they ingest. And here's the thing, like, there is no study you could show me, no matter how peer-reviewed, double, triple blind, like control group of a gajillion, like sample size n equals 10 million, whatever. There is no study you can show me that would persuade me that that's true, because I know it's not true. Not only is it obviously not true in my personal experience, but like everybody in the world that I know who have ever like encountered in this way will tell you that, like, if you eat less and you keep all other factors equal, you'll lose weight. You might not lose weight as quickly as other people. You might not lose weight down to the level of other people. There are genetic factors that will affect this. But you see people, I guess is all I'm saying, to Ryan's point, you see people trotting out studies that defend the most cuckoo bananas claims that we all know are false. And then you see people in response being like, no, you're wrong. Here's my study that shows the opposite, which strikes me as just like the incorrect response. Because once you're at a place where you can manipulate the numbers to tell people that their lion eyes are deceiving them, like, there is kind of an epistemological problem where, okay, maybe this is a useful tool in some domains when at the margins of our knowledge, but surely it can't be like the criterion of truth, since you can obviously make it say anything. And like in nutrition, you know, my dad always jokes that he wants the eggs back that he didn't eat back when eggs were unhealthy, you know. And that it just seems like there is this, Ryan, this sort of fideistic approach that you're describing creates an insane cognitive dissonance where people can stand there with their faces hanging out and say what is obviously cope or obviously like sort of wishful thinking, with the imprimatur of, you know, absolute truth.
Well, and it becomes a substitute for an older way of approaching politics, which was kind of prudentially and commonsensically, which is really how most people do politics, even with the explosion of social sciences. John Marini, the great sage one of the great sages of Claremont, he was riffing off an area close to his heart of study, which is the modern administrative state and all these questions of epistemology and ontology and natural right and all the rest. And he just, you know, he said that basically the job of the university today is to do the applied science of the administrative state. I mean, and it's no accident that the modern research university and the PhD programs as well, you know, they weren't really around in America till the late 19th century. And it shouldn't be a surprise that the growth of these two hydras sort of coincide, that is modern social sciences, if you couldn't hear the scare quotes, I was making them, and their service to the state and the sort of intertwined nature of those two disciplines. And then you throw in as well, I mean, the major funder of so much of this research is the federal government itself. So it becomes a kind of solipsistic exercise in a weird mix of self-justification and you know, thumb on the scale, both on the side of the research funding and then on the side of the conclusions, which need to be favorable to the growth of state power and its exercise.
You know, Ryan, you and I were just before we started recording talking about how we both listened to Steve Saylor on the Red Scare podcast when we were on our off hour, and he's having this moment, right? He's got this book coming out called Noticing, which is a reference to the fact that he calls political correctness a war on noticing. But he also has another dictum among his many kind of bon mots, is that like what the data says and what your regular experience say are the same world. Like there's not two different universes, one of which is described by these arcane occult science practices and the other of which is described by your foolish, like, you know, ape brain. But actually, like, the normal real world is the world described by data. And one thing this helps, I think, to do is to illustrate like that clever manipulation of data can fool non-experts. Like there's all sorts of things you can do if you have relatively skillful facility with the mathematics of statistics, especially select the sample size in a particular way, like orient your, you know, all sorts of problems with studies. And I think this is true of economics too, that the layman wouldn't be able to spot. And then certainly the layman reading a science journalist about data wouldn't be able to spot. And this is what gives a guy like Saylor, however furiously his critics may attempt to unperson him, this is why he continues to have his moment, is because he has this currency as like a person with a lot of sophistication and numeracy when it comes to reading statistics, who is also able to maintain like one grip on just a straightforward realist sense about the world, that our human perception and experience of things is not an accident or bunk or a fluke. It's like what we seek to explain and augment with our data. And I think it is kind of interesting that like in this moment that the replicability crisis is kind of creeping its tendrils out of the soft sciences of psychology into what I was calling the dad bod science of economics. That's like a little soft, but still pretty hard, and perhaps like, on its way into larger disciplines. It's interesting that, this is also the moment of like people turning en masse to Steve Saylor, despite everybody's best efforts to make him persona non grata.
Yeah, and the in many ways, I forget whose theme this is. It's Saylor's among others. I think he's talked about it, but he's not the only one. In many ways, the sources of prosperity and Anglo-American prosperity and greatness was not. I mean, the experts and had their day, of course, the Manhattan Project and all the rest. But earlier than that, through the 17th, 18th centuries, the Great Age of Invention and industrialization, it was a lot of amateur tinkerers, the sort of homegrown, quote unquote, scientist. And there were, clubs there. The UK has a long tradition and a little bit America too. They copied the UK, long tradition of these societies for the study of science, astronomy, or whatever. And it was gentlemen, amateurs who were quite learned on subjects they liked, advancing the field of human knowledge. And so, in that sense, the modern research university is an aberration in Western civilization rather than the norm. May we all return.
Yeah, I think that's where the rubber hits the road, is like these universities are trying to figure out how to square the circle on speech and protests and identity politics. And meanwhile, what is the nature of the institution that they are all trying so hard in some way to preserve? Well, I mean, the replicability crisis has been going on now for a long time. And like the track record of economists has been bad for a long time. And these like batteries of data-driven theories about how to take ever more comprehensive control over some subset of human life and then extrapolate that out into the rest of human life. It hasn't been academics who have been successful at doing this. It has been people out there in the wild who have said, I'm just going to hold down the button on the money printer and no one's going to stop me. It's people who have said, you go back to Karl Rove sort of lecturing the journalists, like, we will continue to make and remake reality and you'll continue to write about it. And that's the nature of the world. So this interview is over. It's been just kind of open season on this policy making by excess, blowing the financial system out of all human proportion, abstracting war into this like weird thing that no one really participates in. It's people sitting in trailers, people sitting at cubicles, trying to push casualties down to nothing. It really has been sort of like the virtualization of our political and economic life. And then with COVID and the lockdowns, we saw the virtualization of our social life. And at some point you have to ask yourself, like, why do the universities deserve, in what sense have they earned the privilege of carrying on in this manner, even setting aside all of the campus craziness and these ridiculous doctrines? Obviously those are a problem, but the normal that they're trying to get us back to is a normal in which, these over-credentialed, overly intellectualized figures try to remake the regime into, a manager's paradise. We already know that doesn't work. It's been failing for at least 25 years, probably longer than that. And it's going to be a hard landing, probably for the universities and maybe for the rest of us as well in some sense.
Yeah, you mentioned COVID, James. This Spencer was the perfect example of the kind of idiots on the internet throwing studies at each other, and also, and just the example of government. As soon as it was politically advantageous, just completely ignoring all the centuries worth of epidemiological data they had. And you look, someone quoted this stat the other day. I didn't realize it existed, but it makes sense to me. It really just Sweden seems to be the only country across, with maybe a couple of other exceptions, the only country across the greater sort of continental and Anglosphere that didn't completely botch their COVID response. They didn't close their schools at all, which was the old rule with a respiratory pandemic, or that it does not have a super high mortality rate for you, especially for young people. You don't want to close the schools. You want to get herd immunity quickly and keep the schools open. And Sweden did it. And I think the stat is that not a single student died in Sweden from mass exposure in schools. And yet, my former home state of California, blessed be her past glory, long gone now, kept kids out of school for the better part of a year and a half. Yeah.
But I don't think how many students in America died of COVID?
I doubt very many.
Very many.
I mean, not to plug my forthcoming book, but to plug my forthcoming book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, How New Science is Illuminating Ancient Truths About God. Your mileage may vary, but for my money, this does kind of go back to this like French post-Newtonian idea. Like right after Newton in France, you get all these Enlightenment philosophes, and their kind of hero after Newton is this guy Pierre-Simon Laplace, who is one of the great Newtonian astronomers of the 18th century, and lives this amazing life, like survives the French Revolution, goes on to be a minor player in Napoleon's regime, but unlike Newton, thinks that what Newtonian mechanics and classical physics means is that now at last we can get human perception out of the way and arrive at a picture of the world that is purely rational and totally measurable and calculable. And it's called Laplace's demon. It's this like mathematical vision of the deist God that if you could get a mind, or I don't know, maybe a supercomputer that could know the position and initial velocity of every particle in the universe, like all time, past, present, and future, would be deterministically laid out before you, and everything would be as in one eternal present. And wouldn't it be great if we could attain that state of consciousness also, and simply vanish from the world and look upon it as this like mechanical dead object? And I raise all this because, Ryan, there are like direct political implications of thinking about the world that way. If that's what reality is, then it follows directly that ideal politics would just be getting a handle on the right levers that make peace and prosperity happen. Yeah. And never mind like what individual people think or want. And so it does kind of matter that in the soft sciences, also analogously in the hard sciences with quantum physics, like we are coming to realize that Laplace's idea about the world is simply false. It may persist as a sort of theological premise of many public statements, but as actual physics, like it just turns out to be wrong. And even before quantum physics, you get Ludwig Boltzmann in the second law of thermodynamics just being like, no, we don't actually, even if you knew all this information, you still wouldn't be able to predict the future with exact accuracy, which means that like human choice and human involvement and participation and prudence and all the stuff that we're always arguing for in the Claremont Institute, like still actually it matters. And if you ignore that and pretend like you're just going to arrive at the study that will tell you what to do during COVID, for example, what you're actually going to end up doing is just like picking whichever study from whichever perspective gives the sort of fake like mystique imprimatur of science to what amounts to your arbitrary and willful tyrannical rule. And that's what happened.
Yeah. Marini likes to quote Auguste Comte, another Frenchman. I think
another positive. I mean, similar.
Positivist. Right, yeah. With the sort of grandfather of applied social sciences and policy. Well, we've run out of time, so we'll have to instruct everyone on what to read at the damn site next week. But in the meantime, I want to thank everyone for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to look at the rest of our work, go to our various websites, AmericanMind.org, ClaremontReviewBooks.com, Claremont.org. If you'd like to support our work, Claremont.org/donate. Please rate well this show. Even review it if you can. It helps boost our visibility wherever you get your podcasts. And thank you, as always, to the engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Logan Zeppieri. We will talk to you all next week.